I came back to my office after lunch, coffee still warm in my hand. The hallway on the seventh floor was so quiet I could hear the click of my heels against the tiles. But as I neared my research wing, the air changed. My office door was slightly open, white light spilling out, and a low, steady voice mixed with the sound of papers being turned. I stopped at the doorway. Three men in navy suits stood around my desk. One wore gloves, going through a drawer. Another held a camera, snapping pictures of my monitor. The third was reading a thick printed document. Two security officers from the Institute stood nearby, watching in silence. No one noticed me until I spoke. "Excuse me, what's going on here?" The oldest man turned around. He introduced himself as Thomas Ward, a representative from the Federal Health Department conducting an emergency inspection for data safety. His tone was flat, emotionless. I asked for the reason, since every audit had to be announced at least 3 days in advance. He glanced down at the paper in his hand, hesitated, then said this was a special request from the board, triggered by an anonymous report about a potential leak of patient gene data. The phrase gene data leak sent a chill down my spine. I knew exactly what was stored in my system, all internal data, encrypted, untraceable outside the lab. I asked who filed the report. Ward looked at me for a moment, then said, short and calm, "Dr. Marla Keene." Her name cut through the air, sharp and cold. I turned toward the frosted glass down the hall. At the end of the corridor, Marla stood talking to an assistant, a cup of tea in her hand, her back slightly tilted. When our eyes met through the glass, she smiled, a small, knowing smile, the kind you wear when you've already predicted someone's reaction. I knew that look. I'd seen it 2 years ago, in a meeting where she presented my 3-month project without mentioning my name once. Ward motioned for me to step back so they could continue. I set my coffee on the side table, nodded, and kept my voice steady. "I'll cooperate. Could you specify the scope of the inspection?" They said they'd review all devices, personal drives, and any paper records related to the project. I moved to the waiting chair in the corner, watching. The clicking of keys, the shutter of the camera, the sound of paper, everything fell into rhythm, mechanical and precise. Every trace of my working life was being taken apart, recorded as evidence. I focused on my breathing, staring through the large window toward the parking lot where the Texas sunlight glared in golden streaks. In my head, I started connecting the dots. The meeting last week when Marla asked about the secondary data sets, the email she sent to management, seizing me, sweetly suggesting a review of security protocols. All of it fit together now, like a test prearranged long before today. One inspector opened my bottom drawer and pulled out my backup drive. He asked for the decryption password. I read out the string. The computer lit up, listing the folders. He paused at one called Human Resonance Log. I caught the quick glance the three men exchanged. Interest, maybe excitement. They asked what it was. I answered evenly, an approved side project, studying team cooperation metrics. They said nothing, just copied the entire folder and continued. An hour later, they packed their equipment, thanked me briefly, and said they'd return in the afternoon for a preliminary report. When they left, my office looked the same, yet everything felt off. Papers were slightly out of place, the monitor still glowing, and the air held a faint metallic scent, like after rain. I looked around the room and saw my reflection dimly in the glass. To anyone walking in, it would look like an ordinary scientist after a routine audit. But I knew something had just been set in motion. I gathered a few papers, shut down the monitor, and stepped into the hallway. Marla was still there, near the coffee machine. When I passed, she looked up and said lightly, "Heard they inspected your lab. Hope it wasn't anything serious." I met her gaze. "I hope so too." Then I walked on. The sound of my heels echoed softly across the floor, blending with the steady hum of the air conditioning. Outside, the sunlight had grown harsher. I wasn't afraid, just felt an emptiness spreading inside me, cold and clear. In this line of work, people can copy data, fake results, or even simulate system errors. But there's one thing they can't fake: the silence that follows when something's been tampered with. And in that moment, I knew this was only the beginning. I stood by the window, watching the Texas sun glare against the glass. the weight of the inspection still pressing on me. Sometimes all you have left is the silence between suspicion and truth, not knowing which one will reach you first. If you're still listening, tell me, where are you right now? Drop it in the comments. And if you like stories where revenge comes through intellect, not noise, don't forget to follow. Because what just happened was only the beginning. I came home that night with my head still spinning from the images of the afternoon, the cold lights of the lab, the clicking of the camera, the fleeting smile on Marla's face. I opened my laptop and sat in front of the screen in my small apartment in South Austin. Outside, the wind rattled the window, carrying the heavy heat and the smell of asphalt after a long day. On the table lay my old notebook, still open to the last line I'd written 2 years ago. Data only reflects what we choose to see. 2 years ago, that was when Marla and I were still working in the same research group. Back then, Helix and Labs had just launched a major project called Project Insight, using genetic algorithms to predict the likelihood of rare diseases. Marla and I were assigned as co-leads. I handled data architecture, while she took charge of publication and scientific communications. Everything went smoothly at first, until the day of the first results presentation. Marla stood before the board, presenting the report I had written myself. Every chart, every annotation, was the result of hundreds of hours of analysis. But when the director asked a question, she simply smiled and said, "We developed our own optimization method. Not a single mention of my name, not even a glance." I just sat there, hand tightening around my pen, listening to the applause echo around the room. After that meeting, her name appeared in every media article. Mine appeared nowhere, just listed internally under technical support. I didn't say a word. In research, credit theft isn't rare, but from that day on, I avoided every joint project with Marla. She still greeted me kindly, sometimes even brought coffee to my desk, but her eyes, those calculating, measuring eyes, were something I could never forget. A year later, when Project Insight ended, I asked to transfer to a smaller team focused on behavioral research within work environments. That was when I began developing Human Resonance Log, an internal analytics tool to measure how effectively teams collaborated. The system only scanned emails and work messages, never private content, analyzing levels of cooperation through patterns of positive language. The idea was simple: measure teamwork through the way people talk. When I presented the trial to management, they found it fascinating. The technical director said, "If this works, it could help us understand which teams are struggling and which ones are thriving." The project got approved. I began rolling it out on a small scale, just a few volunteer teams, nothing mandatory. Marla found out about it when we met at the year-end conference. She gave a faint, mocking smile when she heard me describe it. "Eva, do you really believe attitude can be quantified? People here care about results, not feelings." I answered calmly, "Results are made by people, and people aren't machines." After that day, I stopped thinking about her. I drowned myself in work, in lines of code and endless reports. But over the past few months, I began noticing small changes. Marla often asked the director about data security and ongoing projects. She started joining unrelated committees, citing the need for transparency. Then one day, she requested temporary access to the shared database, claiming it was for an ethics review. I didn't object. Everything I had was compliant. But looking back now, I realized she'd been setting it up for a long time. I opened my old emails. There it was, a message from Marla sent 3 months ago. "We should be cautious about collecting emotional data. The line between research and privacy violation is thin." At the time, I thought she was just being careful. Now I know, it was the first seed of doubt she planted. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, my mind heavy. I thought about today, how she stood in the hallway, calm, composed, as if everything was unfolding exactly as planned. I wasn't afraid, but there was a dull ache in my chest, the quiet fear that once someone is willing to distort the truth, logic no longer matters. I turned off the lights, leaving only the soft glow of the screen reflecting on the wall. That faint blue reminded me of the first night I wrote the opening lines of Human Resonance Log. Back then, I believed data could help people understand one another. Now, I wasn't so sure. I stared at my reflection on the dimming screen and wondered if tomorrow the only thing left in that lab would be the data, or my faith in humanity. I arrived at the Institute earlier than usual the next morning. The hallway was still dim, lit only by a strip of yellow light from the maintenance lamps. When I opened the door to my office, everything inside was unnaturally tidy, as if yesterday's inspection had never happened. But the first thing I noticed was a folded sheet of paper on my desk, placed neatly beside the keyboard. No heading, just one bold line. The inspection division will return at 10 o'clock to continue reviewing data from the human resonance log system. Please be present. The signature at the bottom belonged to Thomas Ward. I sat down and powered on my computer. A notification appeared on the screen. Access monitored for compliance review. A small red icon blinked in the corner, warning that my account activity was being recorded. I opened the human resonance log folder. All files were intact, but the access timestamp showed late last night, after I had already gone home. They had copied everything. At exactly 10, a knock sounded on the door. Ward walked in with two others, a female legal officer from the Institute and a technical specialist. He asked me to explain in full detail the structure and purpose of the system. I told them clearly that it was an internal research project approved by the Institute's Ethics Committee last February, designed to analyze language and cooperation frequencies between teams without touching any personal data. They listened carefully, took notes, and then asked to see the source code. I opened the file. Hundreds of lines of code scrolled across the screen, blue and cold like flowing water. Ward nodded slightly and motioned for the technician to save a copy. When they finished copying, Ward opened a printed summary report from the previous night. The title caught my eye immediately. Summary of Team Collaboration Index, Human Resonance Log. Beneath it was a long table listing names of staff members with a column labeled Resonance Frequency, representing each person's level of positive interaction. I skimmed through the familiar names: Daniel, Alice, Ford, Kim, all scoring high, between 7 and 9. But when my eyes reached the bottom of the list, I stopped. Marla Keene, 0.0. Ward glanced at that same line. He asked, "Can you explain why Dr. Keene hasn't appeared in any internal collaboration records over the past 2 years?" I answered slowly. The system automatically logs all internal interactions. If someone's name doesn't appear, it means there were no recorded instances of positive communication during that time. Ward nodded without replying, but his expression shifted. He wasn't just questioning me anymore. He was reassessing something larger, the culture of this place. After they left, I sat alone, staring at the report on my desk. Those numbers that once seemed cold now felt heavy. They weren't just data, they were a mirror reflecting how people truly connected, or didn't, with one another. By mid-afternoon, an email from the internal communications team appeared in my inbox. At the request of the inspection committee, all staff are required to attend an emergency meeting regarding data transparency. I didn't need to read further. I already knew who was behind it. A few minutes later, Marla walked into my office. She carried a thick stack of papers and tapped them lightly against my desk. Her tone was steady, almost friendly. "They'll need you to clarify the project's intent. I just want to make sure you understand. This isn't between the two of us anymore. It affects the entire institute." I looked up at her. "What exactly are you trying to say, Marla?" She smiled, that same small, measured smile. Sometimes good intentions can become a threat when people don't understand them. The words sounded like a warning, but in her eyes, I caught a glint of satisfaction. As she walked away, the sound of her heels echoed evenly against the tile floor. She believed she'd just won another round. I turned back to the screen and opened Human Resonance Log again. Streams of data flowed across like living circuitry. I scrolled to the bottom and stopped at the final line, a note I'd written and updated every month. Every act of goodwill leaves a trace, even when people try to erase it. I saved the file, shut down the computer, and sat quietly in the white-lit room. The investigation wasn't over. And maybe what truly unsettled them wasn't the numbers inside the system, but what those numbers were about to reveal. The emergency meeting was held the next morning in the large conference room on the 10th floor of Helixson Labs. I arrived early, but Marla was already there, talking with the communications director and a few members of the executive board. A thick stack of files sat on the table in front of her, corners marked with red sticky notes. When I walked in, she glanced over, offering a brief smile so quick it was easy to miss unless you were looking for it. The room glowed under bright LED lights, cold, sterile, surgical. Thomas Ward sat at the head of the table, flanked by two of the Institute's lawyers and the chief technical officer. The air felt heavy, dense with silence, so still you could hear the digital clock ticking off each second. The meeting began. Ward spoke first. The purpose of this session is to clarify the nature and scope of the Human Resonance Log project and to determine whether it violates any privacy regulations. He looked briefly at me, then turned toward Marla. The initial report came from Dr. Keene, who believes the system may monitor employee behavior beyond ethical limits. Marla stood up. Her voice was clear, measured, and confident, each word delivered like it had been rehearsed 100 times. I fully support improving workplace culture through technology. But when I discovered a system that automatically analyzes staff communication without formal consent, I grew concerned. A tool like this, no matter how well intentioned, could easily be misused. In the wrong hands, it could destroy reputations and careers. A few people nodded. Her tone carried the perfect blend of logic and moral authority, as if she were saving the Institute from itself. I listened in silence. When it was my turn, I kept it concise. This project was approved internally, signed by the Chief Technical Officer, and cleared by the Ethics Committee early last year. It measures the frequency of positive language in team communication. It stores no personal data. Its sole purpose is to study collaboration patterns. Ward asked, "Can you prove that?" I opened my laptop and projected the original design and data processing framework onto the screen. Everything was transparent, stored on secure internal servers, with no external access points or network links. But I knew one thing: technical evidence rarely speaks louder than a clever sentence. Marla stepped in smoothly. "But Eva, can you guarantee your system has never captured personal exchanges?" A simple message like, "Thanks, I owe you coffee," could easily be interpreted as emotional surveillance. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, but the question cut like a blade. All eyes turned toward me. I answered evenly. "If you examine the architecture, you'll see the system detects positive language but doesn't store any content. All personal data is filtered out before analysis." Ward nodded, but the tension didn't ease. I could feel the room watching, weighing, waiting for me to falter. Some scribbled notes. Others just observed. The meeting dragged on for over 2 hours. When it ended, Ward announced that my system access would be temporarily suspended while the investigation continued. Marla lingered near the door, waiting until most people had left before stepping close. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "I just want you to understand. I'm not against you. I'm against the mistake you refuse to see." I met her eyes. "You're not against mistakes, Marla. You just can't stand when someone else is trusted more than you." She gave a faint smile. "Trust is the most fragile thing in science, Eva. It disappears faster than deleted data." Then she walked away, leaving a faint trace of perfume behind in the cold air. I stood there a moment, then turned back to the table. Her presentation materials were still there. I flipped through a few pages and saw what I suspected: some excerpts from the human resonance log data, altered. Phrases replaced, context shifted, enough to make the system look like it analyzed employees' psychological states. I photographed every page quietly, telling no one. She had crossed the very line she once claimed to fear. That afternoon, when I returned to my office, I noticed new entries in the data log, strange code fragments I hadn't written. I opened the Access Journal. There it was, an unfamiliar IP, logged in around midnight using a higher-level internal account. Username: M. Keen Admin. My throat went dry. I knew I couldn't report it yet. If I did, it would look like I was escalating a personal conflict. Instead, I backed up every original file to a personal drive, then sat in silence as the daylight faded and the long hallway outside turned crimson in the setting sun. In the glass reflection, I saw myself sitting still, hands on the desk, eyes fixed on the screen. It wasn't fear anymore. It was something colder, sharper, clarity before the storm. I thought to myself, if she wants to use data to destroy me, then I'll let the data speak the truth. Not in my voice, but in the only language both of us understand: numbers. I reached the Institute before sunrise. The morning air in Austin was dry and cold, the road to the research building covered in a thin veil of mist. When I swiped my badge at the lab door, my palm trembled slightly. The room was silent, the only sound coming from the faint hum of the servers in the distance. I powered on my computer, plugged in the backup drive, and checked the data copies. Everything was intact, but my mind wasn't calm. Something about the way Marla looked at me yesterday, that quiet, overconfident gaze, told me she had done something I hadn't discovered yet. I needed proof. I called Miles, the security engineer in charge of Helixon's internal systems. He was quiet, methodical, and believed only in what could be proven. If anyone would understand me, it was him. When I told him briefly that my system showed signs of interference, he paused before answering. "Meet me in the server room downstairs. Don't talk about this over the phone." The server room was buried deep underground. Cold, cramped, walls of gray concrete, lit by the blinking eyes of hundreds of status lights. Miles sat before 3 large monitors, his face washed in the soft blue glow of streaming code. Without looking up, he said quietly, "I checked the access logs. There's something you need to see." He opened a list of system entries, each line showing time, user, and action. In the middle of those steady lines, one stood out: a midnight login from an internal terminal with clearance higher than mine. Miles read it aloud in a calm, steady tone. User: Marla Keene. Time: around 12:47 in the morning. Action: opened the core analysis file and modified the language processing module. A chill crawled across my skin. He opened another window showing the altered code. The new section enabled emotional analysis in messages, a feature I had never written. Miles pointed at the screen, his voice even. "If anyone reviews this without knowing the original structure, they'll think your system was designed to monitor employees' emotions. It matches her accusations perfectly." I stood still for a moment, forcing myself to breathe. "Can you restore the earlier version?" Miles nodded. "I can, and I will. But you need to stay quiet. If they realize you're investigating this, they'll revoke your access before you can finish." I thanked him and left the room in silence. The hallway downstairs was long and cold, fluorescent lights flickering overhead, my shadows stretching thin across the concrete floor. I knew I was walking deeper into a battle no one else fully understood. The rest of the day, I pretended nothing had happened. I answered emails, chatted with colleagues, and even smiled when Marla passed by. She stopped at my desk, her tone casual. "Everything all right, Eva? I heard Mr. Ward's been taking a special interest in your project." Her voice was calm, but beneath it, I could feel her probing. I smiled and replied evenly, "All good. Thanks for checking. In." When she turned and walked away, her posture perfectly straight, a cold tension spread from my chest down to my fingertips. Late in the afternoon, a message from Miles appeared on my phone. I restored the original version. "There's a log confirming Marla made the edits. I'll print the report tonight." I stared at the message, my thoughts heavy. It wasn't relief I felt, something between worry and resolve. Driving home, I noticed a black SUV parked across the gate of the Institute, engine running, lights off. As I looked its way, it pulled into traffic and disappeared. Maybe a coincidence, but my instincts told me otherwise. That night, I sat before my computer, reviewing all the data again. The numbers were still there, orderly, clean. I added a small note in a private file, one that only I could access. No data set ever lies. Only people do when they try to make others believe the lie instead. I read the line once more, then shut the computer. Outside, a storm was rolling in, thunder rumbling in the distance. I knew that once it passed, nothing would be the same again. That night, I barely slept. Rain kept tapping against the window, steady and unrelenting, as if marking the rhythm of something I hadn't fully understood yet. I was exhausted, but my mind wouldn't stop. Every detail from the day circled in my head, fitting together piece by piece, forming a larger, sharper picture. Marla had crossed the line. She wasn't just manipulating data anymore, she was manipulating the narrative. And at Helix and Labs, where data was treated as absolute truth, whoever controlled the story controlled belief itself. The next morning, I arrived later than usual. The air in the office was tight, stretched like a string about to snap. Conversations were hushed, glances averted. Something had spread, rumors, no doubt. When I entered the room, Marla was by the coffee machine, chatting with two new researchers. She saw me and smiled, soft as silk, but her eyes were cold metal. At my desk, I opened my inbox. The first message came from the legal department. Subject line: Notice of temporary suspension of research access. I opened it and read slowly. They cited the need to ensure transparency during the ongoing internal review. The word transparency felt like a knife. Just then, a message from Miles appeared. I just found out. They revoked my access, too. The report I printed last night is gone from the internal directory. Someone deleted it. My pulse spiked. Do you still have a copy? Yeah. Offline. But listen, Eva, looks like they're bringing this to the executive board. You need a smarter move, not just defense. I stared at the screen. Miles was right. If I stayed silent, Marla would win completely. She knew how to shape perception, how to make even the sharpest minds believe she was protecting the Institute. I opened my old notebook, the one filled with handwritten thoughts from past projects. Between the dense pages, I found a line I'd written months ago. In a world ruled by data, truth isn't what's proven, it's what's believed. I knew what I had to do. I would let them believe in data, but this time, the real data, the kind even Marla couldn't erase. That night, I returned to the Institute after hours. I knew the risk, but I went anyway. Rain was still falling, the research complex swallowed in darkness except for a faint light from the second floor, the central control room, where all system logs were automatically stored. I used my backup keycard to unlock the door. The room was cold and humming with the steady whir of fans. I sat down and accessed the secondary server, the weekly backup. They could wipe the main system, but not this one, not without leaving a trace. Lines of code filled the screen. I opened the activity log. Buried among thousands of entries was a single sequence, recorded on the night Miles had mentioned, a temporary login from Marla Keene's account, accessing the Human Resonance Log's core files. Every timestamp, every terminal address, every trace was right there, undeniable, irreversible. I copied everything to my personal drive, then sat still, staring at the glow of the screen. The flickering data reflected in my eyes, thousands of tiny lights whispering the truth. As I stood to leave, the door creaked open. I froze. Marla stepped inside. She didn't look surprised to see me there. If anything, it felt like she had been expecting it. She wore a dark coat, her hair tied back neatly, her voice calm, almost casual. Working late again, Eva? I didn't answer. The monitor behind me was still on, displaying the log entries I'd just uncovered. The light illuminated her face, sharpening that composed, unnerving stillness. Just grabbing a few documents, I said evenly. Marla stepped closer, her gaze landing briefly on the screen. 1 second was all it took for her to realize what she was looking at. But she didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled, a small, knowing smile. You're always the clever one, Eva. But sometimes clever people forget that not every truth is meant to be accepted, especially when it costs people their faith. I said nothing. She reached out, tapped her fingers lightly on the edge of the desk, as if signaling the end of a conversation. Be careful. You don't know what you're fighting against. Then she turned and walked away. The sound of her heels echoed down the corridor, blending with the distant patter of rain against the glass. I sat there, heart pounding, but mind crystal clear. Her words weren't just a warning, they were an admission. Tomorrow, when I present this data to the board, everything will explode. But this time, I wasn't afraid, because I had something she couldn't manipulate, the evidence of her own hand. Before leaving, I opened my notebook and wrote a new line. When a manipulator believes she controls everything, that's when she leaves her perfect evidence behind. I closed the book and stepped out into the cold air. The rain had stopped, but the sky still hung heavy. I took a deep breath and walked into the night, knowing the final round had just begun. The next morning, I arrived at the Institute earlier than usual. The Austin sky was still wrapped in a thin layer of mist. sunlight not yet strong enough to break through. I pushed through the glass doors, swiped my badge, and heard the dry, familiar beep. Everything looked the same, but the air felt different, like the entire building was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. On the way to my office, I could feel eyes following me. Not curious, cautious. The kind of look people give when they've already chosen which side to stand on. Word had spread faster than I'd imagined. Marla knew how to use fear as a weapon. But that morning, I wasn't afraid. I had the truth, and this time, I wouldn't let her twist it. Around 10, the internal announcement echoed through the speakers. All members of the data division report to the central conference room on the fourth floor at 10:30. Mandatory. I knew instantly. This was the meeting, the one who would decide everything. The conference room on the fourth floor was large, surrounded by glass walls, bright with cold white light pouring down from the ceiling. When I walked in, nearly 20 people were already seated around the table: executives, legal staff, technical leads, and at the center of it all, Marla, calm and poised, as if she were about to present an award instead of an accusation. At the head of the table sat Ward, the internal auditor, face stern as ever. He began the meeting in a low, deliberate voice. The preliminary investigation into the human resonance log is complete. Today, both parties will present their statements before the Ethics Council makes its decision. My heartbeat was heavy, but my hands were steady. When Ward gestured to Marla, she rose, straightened her collar, and began with a confident smile. I want to make it clear that I've never opposed Dr. Eva Martin's research. But after reviewing the system code and its output, I found evidence suggesting that personal data had been used without consent, including behavioral and emotional analysis of staff members. I reported this out of responsibility to the Institute's ethical standards. Her tone was precise, her pacing perfect. Every word, ethics, responsibility, transparency, landed exactly where she wanted it. Around the table, a few heads nodded. Those who didn't understand the technical details, or simply feared the conflict, always found it easier to trust the one who sounded composed. When she finished, Ward turned to me. "Dr. Martin, would you like to respond?" I stood, plugged in my drive, and projected my screen onto the glass wall. The display glowed across the room. I took a slow breath and began, calm and clear. The human resonance log was designed solely to identify and encourage collaboration in research environments. Not a single line of the original code collects personal data or performs emotional analysis. I pressed a key. Two versions of the source code appeared. One, original, one altered. I pointed to the new section. This is the code inserted 3 weeks ago. It's what caused the system to be misinterpreted as a psychological monitoring tool. It was added at 12:47 in the morning from an account registered to Marla Keene. The room went silent. I switched to the next slide, an auto-generated server log from the backup system. The timestamps, the terminal ID, the user credentials, everything was there, impossible to deny. Marla sat upright, her eyes narrowing slightly before she smiled again, calm as ever. "Eva, everyone here knows the Institute's logs are prone to record errors. I can prove I wasn't logged in that night. Someone could have easily used my credentials to frame me." Her voice was smooth, her delivery flawless. Then she added, "And you have a motive. You know I've questioned your project before. Blaming me would be the fastest way to protect it." No tremor in her tone, just the quiet confidence of someone who understood how to seed doubt. Ward looked around the table. "Can anyone else verify the authenticity of this log?" The door opened just then. Miles stepped in, wearing his maintenance jacket, a folder in his hand. "I can," he said steadily. "I manage the backup servers. This log was extracted directly from the independent storage system. It can't be altered unless someone wipes the entire infrastructure." Marla's eyes flickered, just for a second, but it was enough. Ward motioned for Miles to hand over the documents. Miles placed them neatly on the table without another word. Ward read a few lines, then looked up at Marla. "Ms. Keene, would you like to add anything?" Marla gave a small, polished smile. "If you want the truth, Mr. Ward, have the technical department verify it." Her voice was still smooth, but her hand on the table tightened slightly. Ward nodded. "We will. But before we adjourn, I'd like to highlight one detail. He turned to the final page of my report, the section showing the collaboration index among staff. Over the past 18 months, Dr. Martin's system has logged more than 120 employees displaying positive collaboration behavior, all but one. You, Dr. Keene. No recorded instances, no positive interactions. I suppose data has its own way of telling a story. Marla said nothing. Her face froze, the smile turning brittle. I stood still, not triumphant, just quietly aware that something fundamental had shifted. In her eyes, this wasn't defeat, it was interruption. Ward adjourned the meeting pending further technical review. As people filed out, Marla passed by me. She paused, leaned closer, and whispered, "You think you've won? Eva, you don't understand. In this world, truth matters less than the one who tells it." Then she walked away, calm and composed, as if stepping off a stage instead of out of an inquiry. I stood there, staring through the glass wall. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight reflected off the building's high windows, bright, sharp, and cold. She was right about one thing: the storyteller holds power. But this time, I was ready to tell my own story, with data, with proof, and with the trust of those who'd seen me work with their own eyes. I left the room slowly, my heart steady. The battle wasn't over. But from that moment, I knew. The balance had shifted. That night, I stayed at the Institute long after everyone else had gone. Not because of work, but because I didn't want to leave. The room was so quiet, I could hear the steady hum of the air conditioning, the faint rattle of a glass cup as the wind slipped through the doorframe. The morning meeting kept replaying in my mind: Ward's gaze, Marla's voice, and that single instant when she lost her composure, even for a heartbeat. I knew she wouldn't stop. Marla wasn't the type to accept defeat. When a door closed, she'd find a wall to break through. And if I wasn't careful, she could turn everything against me. My phone buzzed. A message from Miles. They're checking the system. Ward asked me to send the full backup data, but I think he's testing to see who reacts first. Be careful. I stared at the text, then switched off the screen. Everything was moving toward a point of no return. Part of me wanted it to end, but another part knew that if it ended too soon, the truth would stay buried. I had to let it reveal itself. The next morning, the Texas sky was heavy, the clouds thick with coming rain. As soon as I arrived, I saw a notice pinned to the internal board: Executive Council to convene special session Friday morning. Topic: Legality and impact of the human resonance log system. Below the headline, our names stood side by side, mine and Marla's, two halves of the same story. I wasn't one for confrontation, but I knew I couldn't avoid this one. If Marla took control of the narrative before the council, I would lose everything, not just the project, but my reputation, my credibility, and the principles I'd protected for 4 years at Helixon. Before the meeting, I sat in Ward's office. He looked at me, his expression both stern and tired. "Eva, do you realize what you're about to do could pull a lot of people into this? I believe you, but the council isn't easy to convince. They don't care who's right. They care about what's safe." I nodded, my voice steady. "I understand. But sometimes what's safe isn't what's right. And if someone like Marla controls the story, the truth will never see the light." Ward was silent for a long time. Then he said quietly, "If you really have proof, let it speak for itself. Don't attack. Just show them." I left his office feeling heavier, but surer of my ground. When I entered the large conference room, most of the council was already seated. The glass wall behind them reflected a pale glow. Outside, rain had begun to fall. Marla sat across from me, composed, immaculate, her smile calibrated to the exact degree of confidence. Ward opened with a brief introduction, then handed the floor to her. Marla rose, her voice soft as silk. "Ladies and gentlemen of the council, my intent has never been to attack anyone personally, but I believe every system in a scientific institution must have boundaries. Dr. Martin's project, while well-intentioned, has crossed that line. It creates an emotional evaluation mechanism without informed consent. And that, whether intentional or not, is a form of control. Each word was a knife, gentle, deliberate, precise." Some heads nodded, Others scribbled notes. Marla knew how to turn goodwill into danger with nothing but tone and phrasing. When she finished, Ward signaled to me. I stood, connected my drive to the projector, and brought the data to life on the glass wall. Charts of collaboration metrics, lines of code, and a sequence of logs pulled from a secure backup. My voice was calm, deliberate. The human resonance log does not monitor emotions. It identifies collaborative language, thank yous, constructive feedback, moments of teamwork. This is the technical evidence, stored in the secondary server, proving that no emotional analysis function was ever written by me. I moved to the next slide. The log entry showing who had altered the system appeared on the screen. The room went silent. A council member asked, "Dr. Martin, can you guarantee this data hasn't been tampered with?" Yes. The data is backed up automatically in a restricted environment, accessible only to the technical division. Mr. Miles Grayson, our lead engineer, can confirm. Miles entered at that exact moment, holding a folder of certifications. He verified everything, no embellishment, no hesitation. Marla sat still, her lips pressed together, but I could tell she was recalculating. Then she turned toward the council, her tone still soft, but edged with steel. Even if this system doesn't analyze emotions, doesn't it still create invisible bias? Those who aren't frequently acknowledged could feel excluded. Isn't that just another form of subtle surveillance? Her question stirred the room again. I knew she'd shifted the fight, no longer about data, but about morality, the one battlefield where facts lose precision. I met her eyes, then faced the council. I understand that concern, I said, and that's why I want to show you something Marla hasn't mentioned. I pressed a key. The screen filled with names, hundreds of them. Security staff, lab technicians, engineers, researchers. People are recognized for small, genuine acts of collaboration. Then I scrolled to the final line. The last name appeared, Marla Keene. Next to it, 0 recorded interactions. The silence that followed was complete. I didn't need to explain. The data had spoken. I said quietly, "The system doesn't exclude anyone. It simply reflects what people choose to show." Ward looked around the table, then closed his folder. "Thank you both. The council will review this and issue its decision." As everyone began to leave, I stood by the glass wall, watching the fading rain outside. Marla gathered her papers slowly. When she passed me, she leaned in and whispered, "You might win this round, Eva. But remember, people believe the story that comforts them, not the one that's true." Then she walked away, her heels echoing softly against the polished floor. I didn't feel anger or triumph, just a quiet exhaustion that settled deep in my chest. She wasn't entirely wrong, but I also knew this time the truth had spoken, and it was strong enough to stand on its own, even without anyone defending it. I took a slow breath, watching the pale light spill across the wet glass. The war was nearly over, but somewhere deep inside, another thought began to form. Maybe the real victory wasn't proving who was right. Maybe it was reminding people that some things remain true, even when others try to blur them. 3 days after the hearing, Helix and Labs returned to its usual rhythm, or at least the illusion of it. Hallway conversations had quieted. The curious glances were gone. Yet the air still carried something unnamed, like everyone knew something important had happened, but no one wanted to say it aloud. On Monday morning, an email from Ward appeared in my inbox. The subject line contained only 4 words: Council meeting results. I opened it and read slowly. The Council has reviewed all technical evidence and verified witness statements. No violations of research protocol or ethical conduct were found in the human resonance log system. The system is approved to continue and expand as an institute-wide pilot program. However, a voluntary participation policy must be added for all staff. Dr. Marla Keene will be reassigned to an independent technical division to continue in a role more suited to her expertise. I read to the end and sat still. There was no triumph, only a soft, exhausted relief, like stepping off a steep hill after a long climb. I closed my laptop and looked out the window. The Austin sky was a rare, brilliant blue. When I arrived at the Institute, the atmosphere had changed. Daniel placed a cup of coffee on my desk, smiling. "Congratulations, doctor. Everyone's happy for you." Oh, and Ward wants to see you in the small conference room at 10. I thanked him. As I walked down the hallway, a few colleagues patted my shoulder. Some just smiled. No one said much, but their eyes did. Respect. Maybe because, in a place where trust was often buried beneath numbers and metrics, I had reminded them that fairness could still exist. Ward was standing by the window when I entered. He turned, his voice warm but measured. Ava, the council didn't just clear you. They want you to lead the Human Resonance Log as an official institute program, to expand it across teams, integrate it into our HR systems. They're calling it Project Human Pulse. I blinked. Human Pulse? He nodded. A way to measure an organization's rhythm, not through KPIs, but through kindness. He smiled, rare and brief. And you've earned it. I thanked him and stepped out, emotions tangling inside me. Through the glass corridor, I saw Marla packing up her desk in the opposite wing. She wore a gray coat, her expression calm, unreadable. As I passed, she looked up. Our eyes met for a second. No anger, no challenge, just a quiet acknowledgement between two people who'd reached the end of a long war. She nodded once. I nodded back. Some battles don't need a winner, only closure. That afternoon, I met with Miles and Daniel to plan the expansion. When the meeting ended, Miles lingered. He sat down, watching me for a moment before saying softly, You know, Eva, what you built, it's not just a system, it's a mirror. It forces people to look at themselves. I smiled faintly. Sometimes that's what scares them the most. Back at my desk, my old notebook lay open. I flipped to a blank page and wrote, There are people who create wounds, and people who create light. But only in deep darkness do we learn which light is real. That afternoon, the Institute held its first internal meeting since the project was reinstated. I stood on the small stage, facing familiar faces, Daniel, Alicia, Miles, and the new recruits. I told them the story of the Human Resonance Log, not as a technical tool, but as a story about trust, about how small acts of kindness could change the air in a room, a team, even an entire organization. Data can measure productivity, efficiency, and risk, I said, but no number can measure compassion. Human Pulse is just a reminder that even in a place built on machines, there are still people. The room was silent for a moment, then broke into gentle, sustained applause. I bowed my head, my throat tight. When everyone left, I stayed behind. The afternoon light slanted through the glass, painting a gold stripe across my desk. I opened my laptop. The screen flickered on. Human Pulse, version 1.0 initiated. Below it appeared the first entries, messages of gratitude, small gestures of support, traces of quiet kindness from every corner of the Institute. I watched them for a while, then typed the first note of this new chapter. Data never lies, but people only see the truth when they choose to believe in what's good. I saved the file and closed the screen. Outside, the evening wind brushed through my hair. The Texas sky glowed amber, clouds drifting slowly across pale blue. I took a deep breath, feeling a peace I hadn't known in months, one I'd earned through sleepless nights, through silence instead of anger. As I left the building, Marla emerged from the side gate. She walked slowly, eyes forward. When we crossed paths, she stopped without turning. Eva, thank you for keeping things fair. I think I needed that more than I realized. I said nothing, just watched her silhouette fade into the sunset, and something inside me quietly released. That night, back in my small apartment, the golden lamplight cast a calm glow against the walls. I opened my notebook and wrote one final line, not for the data, not for the system, but for myself. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives in silence, when both the hurt and the hurting can finally breathe again. That's when the truth is restored. I set down the pen, closed my eyes, and let my breath slow. If you're still listening, maybe you've lived your own quiet battle, where truth was doubted, where patience cost more than pride. If so, remember this: kindness is not weakness, it's endurance. And if you believe, as I do, that small acts can transform entire spaces, stay. Because sometimes peace itself is the most beautiful form of revenge.